There are voices that feel like they were born from the land itself, voices that carry the chill of an ocean wind, the rumble of a distant freight train, the vast, aching loneliness of a prairie sky at dusk. They are voices that don't just sing notes, they narrate the human condition. And one of the most authentic, most resilient voices of the 20th century belonged to a man who called himself the Singing Ranger. His name was Hank Snow. To generations of country music fans, he was an icon, a pillar of the grand ole Opry, clad in dazzling rhinestone suits, his hand steady on the neck of his Martin guitar. He was the man with the unmistakable rolling baritone who told us he was moving on, the troubadour who had been everywhere. He projected an image of unbreakable confidence, a man who had conquered the world with a song. But that image, like the rhinestones on his suit, was something carefully constructed to catch the light and hide the darkness underneath. The story of Hank Snow is not a simple tale of rags to riches. It is a harrowing saga of survival against odds that would have broken most people. Before he was the Singing Ranger, he was Clarence Eugene Snow, a boy born into crushing poverty and then plunged into a nightmare of unimaginable abuse. He was a stuttering, terrified child who ran away from home at the age of 12 to face the brutal indifference of the North Atlantic Sea. This is not just a biography of a musician. This is an exploration of trauma and transcendence. It's the story of how a boy with a broken voice found a way to sing, how a man haunted by his past would, in a forgotten twist of history, become the first true believer in the future king of rock and roll. To truly understand the songs, you must first understand the scars. So settle in, because this is the epic, unvarnished, and ultimately triumphant ballad of Hank Snow. Our story begins in Brooklyn, a tiny hardscrabble fishing village in Queens County, Nova Scotia, on May 9, 1914. This was a time and a place far removed from the burgeoning promise of the new century. Here, life was a constant, grinding struggle against the elements and economic hardship. The soil was thin, the winters were brutal, and the Atlantic Ocean was both the primary source of livelihood and a constant looming threat. Clarence Snow was the fifth of 6 children born to George and Maud Snow. George was an unskilled foreman in a local sawmill, a man whose work was often seasonal and whose pay was meager. The family lived in what could only be described as abject poverty. There were days when there was simply not enough food to go around. Maud, however, possessed a spark of artistry. She was a talented musician who played piano and sang, sometimes finding work providing musical accompaniment for silent films in nearby towns. Music was the one small luxury, the one glimmer of beauty in the otherwise bleak existence of the Snow household. This fragile stability, however, shattered when Clarence was just 8 years old. His parents, worn down by poverty and personal differences, went through a bitter divorce. In the 1920s, in a deeply religious and traditional community, this was a profound social disgrace. The family was torn apart. The children were parceled out to various relatives, and young Clarence was sent to live with his paternal grandmother. For 2 years, he experienced a brief period of relative peace, but it was a temporary reprieve. When he was 10, his mother, Maud, desperate for a new start, reclaimed him. She had remarried, hoping to provide a stable home for her son. Instead, she unwittingly led him into the darkest chapter of his life. Her new husband, whose name does not deserve to be memorialized, was a cruel and sadistic man. From the moment he entered Clarence's life, the boy became the target of his unyielding rage. The home became a prison, a place of constant simmering terror. The abuse was relentless and systematic, a campaign designed to obliterate a child's sense of self-worth. It was brutally physical. Beatings with fists, belts, and whatever object was at hand were a daily occurrence. Clarence was frequently locked in the cold, lightless cellar, sometimes for days, with little food or water. But the psychological torment was perhaps even more damaging. He was subjected to a constant barrage of verbal abuse, told he was stupid, useless, a drain on the family. This constant degradation, this emotional battery, had a devastating effect. The bright, inquisitive boy began to withdraw into himself. He developed a severe and debilitating stutter, a physical manifestation of the fear that now choked him. He lived in a state of hypervigilance, his nervous system perpetually on high alert, waiting for the next explosion of violence. The stories from this period are the stuff of nightmares. In one instance, his stepfather, in a fit of rage over a minor chore done incorrectly, dragged the boy to the wood stove, grabbed his hands, and held them against the hot cast iron, searing his palms. This was the reality of his childhood. There was no escape, no one to turn to. His mother Maud seemed powerless, trapped in her own cycle of fear and dependency, unable to protect her own son from the monster she had married. She had given him the gift of music, but she could not give him the gift of safety. For 4 years, he endured this torment. But by the age of 12, a breaking point was reached. A primal instinct for survival overrode the learned helplessness. He knew, with the certainty of a condemned man, that if he did not escape, he would not survive. So one day, with a resolve born of pure desperation, Clarence Eugene Snow, a boy of 12 with a crippling stutter and a soul full of wounds, ran away from home. He walked out the door and never looked back, heading towards the only thing he knew that was as vast and as merciless as his own suffering: the sea. Imagine being 12 years old, utterly alone, and your only option is to sign on as a cabin boy, a flunky, on a Grand Banks fishing schooner. This wasn't a romantic adventure. It was a brutal, unforgiving existence. These were the days of the legendary iron men in wooden ships. The work was perilous and exhausting. For the next 4 years, the sea was his life. He was up before dawn, hauling heavy nets in freezing spray, gutting thousands of cod and halibut until his hands were raw and permanently smelled of fish, and collapsing into a damp bunk at night, too tired to even dream. The dangers were constant. The North Atlantic is home to some of the world's worst weather. He endured hurricanes, rogue waves, and the ever-present threat of icebergs. In one terrifying incident that he would recount for the rest of his life, a massive wave swept him completely overboard into the churning, icy water. It was a death sentence. By a sheer miracle, as the ship rolled back, the rigging dipped into the sea, and he managed to grab hold of a rope. His stunned shipmates hauled his half-drowned hypothermic body back on deck. He had looked death in the face and, somehow, survived. This life of hardship and isolation forged in him an incredible resilience, a deep-seated toughness that would define his character. But it was also profoundly lonely. He was a boy among hardened, often illiterate men. The stutter still plagued him, making communication difficult and marking him as different. It was in this crucible of loneliness that music became his lifeline. His mother, Maud, had ordered his first guitar from the Eaton's catalog for $5.95, a treasure he had to keep hidden from his stepfather. That guitar was gone, but the memory of it burned within him. He painstakingly saved the pittance he earned at sea. On a rare trip back to port, he walked into a pawn shop and bought a used, beat-up guitar. That simple wooden box became his sanctuary. In the cramped, damp forecastle of the ship, during precious moments of downtime, he would practice until his fingers bled. He had no formal training. His teacher was a crackling radio signal, and his primary inspiration was the haunting voice of Jimmie Rodgers, the father of country music. Rodgers was a former railroad brakeman who sang about drifting, about loving and leaving, about the hard lot of the working man. His famous blue yodel was a cry of pure, unadulterated loneliness that resonated in the deepest parts of the young sailor's soul. Rodgers' music gave Clarence a language for his own unspoken pain. He absorbed Rodgers' style, learning to mimic his yodel, mastering his unique guitar phrasing. The act of playing was transformative. When he held the guitar, he was no longer a powerless victim or a lonely cabin boy. He was a creator. And when he sang, something magical happened. The stutter, the physical cage that trapped his words, completely disappeared. The flow of melody unlocked a fluency he couldn't find in speech. In song, he was whole. In song, he was free. He didn't know it yet, but on those storm-tossed nights in the middle of the ocean, Clarence Snow was dying, and Hank Snow was being born. After 4 years of his life were given to the sea, Hank, now a lean and weathered 16-year-old, decided to try his luck on land. The Great Depression was tightening its grip on Canada, and work was scarce. He took whatever jobs he could find, but his focus was singular: music. His dream was to be on the radio. In 1933, he scraped together the courage to walk into the offices of CHNS, a prominent radio station in Halifax. The audition was a study in contrasts. When asked his name, his stutter was so pronounced he could barely get the words out. The station manager was about to dismiss him as a lost cause. But then Hank sat down, picked up his guitar, and launched into a Jimmie Rodgers song. The room fell silent. The hesitant, stuttering boy vanished, replaced by a confident performer with a clear, resonant voice and a startlingly authentic yodel. He was hired on the spot for a weekly, unpaid 15-minute show. He adopted the stage name Hank the Yodeling Ranger, a clear homage to his hero, and an evocative name that suggested open spaces and a rambling spirit. His show quickly gained a loyal following. There was an honesty in his voice, a sense of lived hardship that listeners, many of whom were struggling through the Depression themselves, recognized and responded to. This period also brought the most important stabilizing force into his life. In 1935, he met Minnie Alders, a beautiful young woman from a local Dutch family. She was charmed by the shy, serious musician. They fell deeply in love and married that same year. Minnie was more than just his wife. She was his partner in every sense of the word. She was his fiercest supporter, his sharpest critic, and, as his career grew, his de facto business manager. She understood the deep wounds he carried from his childhood and provided the unconditional love and security he had never known. Their marriage would last for 55 years, a bedrock of stability in the often chaotic world of show business. A year after his marriage, Hank took a gamble. He traveled to Montreal, the headquarters of RCA Victor in Canada. He talked his way into an audition and impressed the executives enough that they offered him a recording contract. On October 29, 1936, he recorded his first 2 songs, The Prisoned Cowboy and Lonesome Blue Yodel. The record was a hit in the Maritime provinces, launching his career as a recording artist. For the next decade, Hank Snow methodically built his career in Canada. He was no overnight sensation. It was a slow, arduous climb. He toured relentlessly, playing in tiny schoolhouses, grange halls, and dusty theaters across the vast Canadian landscape. He and Minnie often traveled by car, with their young son, Jimmie Rodgers Snow, in tow. He honed his craft, writing more of his own material and slowly developing a style that, while still influenced by Rodgers, was becoming uniquely his own. He became a genuine star in his home country, a beloved figure on Canadian radio. He had achieved a level of success that would have been unimaginable to the abused boy or the lonely sailor. But Hank's ambition was restless. He looked south to the beacon of country music, the place that separated the stars from the legends, Nashville, Tennessee. Breaking into Nashville in the post-war era was like trying to crack a secret society. The country music establishment was a closed circle, dominated by stars from the American South. They were suspicious of outsiders, and a yodeling Canadian with a flashy guitar style didn't exactly fit the mold. Hank made several trips to Nashville, spending what little money he had knocking on doors and playing his records for anyone who would listen. The response was a consistent, soul-crushing no. He was told he sounded too much like Jimmy Rogers. He was told his style was too polished. He was told he just didn't have the stuff. The rejection was brutal. It dredged up all his old feelings of worthlessness. With his money gone and his spirit flagging, he nearly gave up. He made a tearful call to Minnie, telling her he was a failure and was coming home to Canada for good. But he had one powerful believer in his corner, Ernest Tubb. The Texas troubadour was one of the biggest stars in Nashville and a man of immense influence at the Opry. Tubb recognized Hank's immense talent and work ethic. He went to bat for him, personally lobbying Opry manager Jim Denny to give the Canadian a shot. After months of persistence, Denny finally, grudgingly, agreed. In January 1950, Hank Snow was signed as a member of the Grand Ole Opry. It should have been his moment of triumph, but his American struggles were far from over. His debut performance at the hallowed Ryman Auditorium was met with polite but tepid applause. He wasn't connecting with the audience. The Opry management was unimpressed and gave him the worst performance slots. Like the graveyard shift late on a Saturday night, they paid him the union minimum, barely enough to live on. He was on the verge of being fired, his lifelong dream turning into a humiliating nightmare. On the brink of admitting defeat, he made one last stand. He went to his record label, RCA, and begged them to record a song he had written years earlier. It was an up-tempo, defiant tune with a relentless, chugging rhythm that mimicked the sound of a freight train. The lyrics were a declaration of independence, a story of leaving heartbreak and trouble behind and never looking back. It was the anthem of his entire life. The song was titled "I'm Movin' On." The label executives hated it. They thought another song he'd recorded, "The Golden Rocket," was the obvious hit. They only agreed to put "I'm Movin' On" the B-side, essentially throwing it away. But history and the listening public had other ideas. Almost immediately, a strange phenomenon started happening. DJs across the country began getting calls from listeners asking them to flip the record over. "I'm Movin' On" was an infectious, unstoppable force. It captured the restless, optimistic zeitgeist of a post-war America that was on the move. The song didn't just climb the charts, it conquered them. It hit #1 on the Billboard country chart and refused to leave, staying in the top spot for an astounding, record-shattering 21 consecutive weeks. It crossed over to the pop charts, making Hank Snow a household name across the entire nation. The success was so massive, so definitive, that it completely rewrote his story. The Nashville establishment that had shunned him was now forced to embrace him as one of its biggest stars. He went from the verge of being fired from the Opry to being one of its headliners. The song didn't just save his career, it made him a legend. For the next 4 decades, Hank Snow was a constant, towering presence in country music. The hits were numerous and iconic. The Rumba Boogie, I Don't Hurt Anymore, Now and Then There's, A Fool Such as I, and his other signature masterpiece, the rapid-fire geographical tour de force, I've Been Everywhere. He became a showman of the highest order, famous for his dazzling custom-made nudie suits and his energetic stage presence. He was a consummate professional, a perfectionist who demanded the best from his band, the Rainbow Ranch Boys. But his journey had one more shocking, world-altering chapter yet to be written. By the mid-1950s, Hank Snow was at the apex of his career. He wasn't just a singer, he was an entrepreneur, running his own successful tour promotion company with his manager Tom Parker. This manager, who insisted on the absurd title of Colonel, was a former carnival barker with an unparalleled genius for promotion and a morally flexible approach to business. It was in this capacity that Hank first heard about a revolutionary new talent. A DJ at the Louisiana Hayride, a popular radio show and Opry competitor, kept telling him about a young singer from Memphis who was causing riots with his scandalous hip-shaking and a sound that defied categorization. His name was Elvis Presley. Intrigued, Hank got his hands on Elvis's first record from Sun Studios. He listened to the A-side, That's All Right, and then flipped it over to the B-side, a wild, supercharged reimagining of the bluegrass sacred text, Bill Monroe's Blue Moon of Kentucky. Most of the Nashville Old Guard heard it as blasphemy. Hank Snow heard it as genius. He heard a raw, untamed energy that he knew was the future. In Elvis's voice, he recognized the same kind of revolutionary spark that Jimmie Rodgers had possessed a generation earlier. Hank moved quickly. He signed Elvis to a management contract and, using his considerable clout, did for Elvis what Ernest Tubb had done for him. He got him a coveted guest spot on the Grand Ole Opry in October 1954. The performance is now the stuff of legend. Elvis, nervous but electric, launched into his version of Blue Moon of Kentucky. The audience of country music purists sat in stunned silence. They didn't boo, but their polite, confused applause was perhaps even worse. After the show, Opry manager Jim Denny famously and foolishly advised Elvis to go back to his old job driving a truck. Elvis was heartbroken, but Hank's belief was unshaken. He knew the Opry was the wrong stage, but the talent was undeniable. To manage this explosive new act, Hank formalized his partnership with Colonel Tom Parker. They created a joint venture, Hank Snow Attractions, sole proprietors of Elvis Presley. Hank believed they were a team. He, the seasoned artist, would guide Elvis's musical development, while the Colonel would handle the hype. It was a fatal miscalculation. Hank Snow, the artist who had survived so much, was utterly unprepared for the Machiavellian cunning of Colonel Parker. The Colonel saw Elvis not as an artist, but as a commodity of unimaginable value, and he had no intention of sharing. Over the next year, Parker masterfully and ruthlessly maneuvered Hank out of the picture. He renegotiated contracts behind Hank's back, ingratiated himself with Elvis's family, and ultimately severed all ties, taking sole, iron-fisted control of the Presley career. Hank Snow, the man who had discovered Elvis for the Nashville scene, who had given him his first national platform, was left with virtually nothing. He had held the winning lottery ticket in his hand and had it snatched away. It was a bitter, painful betrayal that he rarely spoke of publicly. But the historical fact remains. A traditional country music legend, a man scarred by his own past, was one of the first people in the entire music industry to recognize the earth-shattering potential of the king of rock and roll. Losing Elvis was a deep professional wound, but Hank's own star continued to shine brightly. He remained a constant, beloved presence on the Opry stage for almost 50 years, a living bridge to the very roots of country music. He toured the world, recorded over 100 albums, and became an elder statesman of the genre. But as he entered the later chapters of his life, the unresolved trauma of his childhood began to demand his attention in a new way. He had built a fortress of fame and success around the wounded boy inside, but he knew that boy was still there. The stutter, though controlled, never entirely left him, a permanent ghost of the terror he had endured. He decided he could no longer remain silent. In a move of incredible courage for a man of his generation and stature, he began to speak publicly about the abuse he had suffered, and he decided to turn his pain into a powerful force for good. In 1978, he founded the Hank Snow International Foundation for the Prevention of Child Abuse. He poured his own time, energy, and millions of his own dollars into the foundation, creating educational programs and support systems for abused children and their families. This became his life's great passion, a mission that clearly meant more to him than any gold record. It was his way of fighting the monster from his own past, his way of ensuring that other children would not have to suffer in silence as he had. He was giving them the safety and the voice that he never had. In this, he achieved a kind of personal redemption that was more profound than any professional accolade. The cycle of abuse, which so often perpetuates itself, was broken by an act of immense compassion and generosity. Hank Snow passed away on December 20th, 1999, at the age of 85, at his beloved Rainbow Ranch in Madison, Tennessee. That ranch, a sprawling 72-acre haven, was more than just a home. It was the physical embodiment of the security and peace he had fought his entire life to find. He was laid to rest, and the world of country music paused to honor a giant. The accolades were, of course, monumental. He was a member of the Country Music Hall of Fame in America, the Nashville Songwriters Hall of Fame, and the Canadian Music Hall of Fame. Think about that for a moment. It's a rare triple crown, a testament to a man who not only conquered a foreign music scene, but became one of its foundational pillars, all while never losing the respect of the country that gave him his start. His musical legacy, etched into more than 100 albums and dozens of timeless hits, is as solid and enduring as the Canadian Shield. But to measure his life only by the plaques on the wall or the gold records in the vault is to read the cover of a book and ignore the epic novel inside. His true legacy, the one that whispers through his recordings and echoes in the story of his life, is a staggering tale of impossible resilience. It is the story of a boy who was thrown away by society, deemed worthless by the very man who should have protected him, and left to fend for himself in a world that showed him no kindness. And from those scraps, from that rubble of a shattered childhood, he built a kingdom. The calloused, scarred hands that learned to fret a guitar in the freezing forecastle of a fishing trawler were the very same hands that would one day accept a Grammy and shake the hands of presidents. That journey is almost too vast to comprehend. Music wasn't just his career, it was his salvation. It was the tool he used to rebuild his own humanity. For a boy who was so terrified he could barely speak his own name, singing became an act of defiance. It was a space where the stutter couldn't follow, a place where his voice was not only clear but powerful and true. It gave him a way to communicate the deep well of pain and loneliness inside him, transforming the ugliest parts of his life into something beautiful and resonant that touched millions. In the most literal sense, the guitar saved his life. His wife, Minnie, the anchor who held him steady through every storm, saved his heart. But music saved his soul. And he was a fascinating, complex man of profound contradictions, wasn't he? Think of the image. The singing ranger in his dazzling custom-made nudie cone suits, shimmering with thousands of rhinestones, each one a tiny star. That wasn't just showmanship, it was armor, It was a brilliant, shining suit of armor for the shy, wounded boy who still lived inside him. So, the next time you hear a Hank Snow song come on the radio, I want you to listen a little differently. Listen past the familiar melody and the steady, rolling baritone. His voice, when you really listen to it now, carries the entire weight of his journey.